The mystery of our naked skin. Look at your arm right now. Go ahead. Really look at it. You probably see some fine hair, maybe barely visible, unless you're in the right light. Now imagine that same arm covered in thick, dark fur, dense enough to keep you warm on a freezing night, protective enough to shield your skin from thorns and insects. That's what your ancestors looked like, not your great-great-great-grandparents. We're talking millions of years back, and somewhere along the way, we lost it, almost all of it. Today, humans are the only primates walking around essentially naked. Chimpanzees have fur, gorillas have fur, orangutans, bonobos. Every single one of our closest relatives is covered head to toe in protective hair. But us, we're bizarre. We're the weird ones. Out of over 5,000 mammal species on Earth, we're one of the very few that decided fur wasn't necessary anymore. We're in the same category as elephants, rhinos, hippos, and whales. And there's a reason those animals are hairless. They're either massive and live in hot climates, or they live in water. We're neither. So, what happened? Why did we lose our fur when every other primate kept theirs? This isn't just a curiosity. This isn't just a curiosity. This is one of the most important questions in human evolution, because losing our fur changed everything. It changed how we hunt, how we survive heat, how we communicate, even how we think about each other. It's written into every aspect of being human, and most of us never stop to wonder about it. If you're listening to this to fall asleep perfect, that's exactly why I make these. So, maybe subscribe. And tell me, where are you right now, and what time is it? I love checking comments. Tokyo at 3 a.m., Chicago at midnight, London during the morning commute. It's wild how we're all here at once. The mystery of our naked skin has obsessed scientists for over a century. Charles Darwin himself was puzzled by it. He could explain why giraffes have long necks and why birds have different beak shapes, but human hairlessness, that one stumped him. He eventually settled on an idea involving sexual selection. Basically, that our ancestors found hairless partners more attractive. But even he wasn't entirely convinced. Since then, researchers have proposed at least a dozen different theories. Some think we lost our fur because we started running long distances in the hot African sun and needed to cool down. Others believe it happened when our ancestors spent time in and around water. Some scientists argue it was about parasites, that getting rid of fur getting rid of disease, carrying ticks and lice. And there are theories involving social signaling, thermoregulation, even brain development. Here's the thing, they might all be partially right. Evolution doesn't usually happen for just one reason. It's messier than that. Multiple pressures working together, each one nudging our ancestors toward less and less body hair over millions of years. But the fact remains that something dramatic happened, something that made our ancestors different from every other primate that ever existed. Think about what that means. Our furless skin isn't just a minor detail. It's a defining feature of what makes us human. It forced us to invent clothing, which led to culture and identity. It made us sweat differently, which let us run farther than almost any animal on Earth. It exposed our skin to the sun, which changed how our bodies produce vitamin D. It made us vulnerable to cold, which pushed us to control fire. It even changed how we read each other's emotions. You can see someone blush. You can see them go pale with fear. Try doing that through a layer of thick fur. The loss of our fur is connected to nearly every major development in human evolution. And yet, for something so fundamental, we still don't have a complete answer for why it happened. The story is scattered across fossil records, genetic studies, and observations of modern primates. It's a puzzle with pieces spread across millions of years. But we're going to put those pieces together. We're going to explore what our furry ancestors actually looked like, examine every major theory about why we went bald, and discover how this one seemingly simple change rippled through human history in ways you've probably never imagined. Let's go back. Our furry ancestors, what we looked like millions of years ago, way back 6 million years ago, before smartphones, before civilization, before fire, before tools, back to a time when your ancestors looked nothing like you. Because here's the thing about human evolution that nobody really talks about. For most of our history, We weren't naked. We were furry, completely covered in body hair from head to toe. Just like every other primate on the planet, picture one of your distant ancestors walking through an African forest 6 million years ago. They're about 4 tall, walking upright more often than their chimpanzee cousins, but still spending plenty of time in the trees. And they're covered in thick, coarse hair, not the fine, almost invisible vellus hair that covers most of your body. Today, we're talking real fur, dense enough to see from a distance, thick enough to provide actual insulation, patented enough that individuals probably had distinctive markings. This wasn't some kind of evolutionary mistake. This was the standard primate operating system. Hair that covered every inch of skin, except the palms, soles, and a few patches on the face. Hair that served dozens of critical functions, that kept our ancestors alive in a world full of dangers we can barely imagine today, and we know they looked like this because. Say of 2 types of evidence that paint an incredibly detailed picture of our hairy past. First, there's the genetic evidence. Every human alive today still carries the genes for full-body hair. They're right there in your DNA, mostly switched off, but occasionally expressing themselves in ways that remind us of our furry heritage. Men with hairy backs, women with hirsutism, children born with hirsutism, children born with hypertrophy, a rare condition where they're covered in thick body hair. These aren't genetic mistakes, they're evolutionary throwbacks, glimpses of what we all used to look like. The genes responsible for hair growth are ancient, so ancient that we share most of them with mice, dogs, and every other mammal on the planet. The specific variants that regulate human hair growth patterns diverge from our chimpanzee cousins around 6 to 7 million years ago, and those early variants coded for full body coverage. We know this because when scientists compare the genetic sequences responsible for hair growth across primate species, humans stand out like a sore thumb. We have all the genes for thick body hair. We just have additional regulatory sequences that suppress their expression over most of our bodies. It's like having a fully functional car sitting in your garage with the emergency brake permanently engaged. All the parts work. They're just being held back by a few extra control mechanisms that evolved relatively recently. This tells us something crucial. Hair loss in humans wasn't about losing the genes for hair. It was about evolving new switches that turned those genes off in specific locations. The second line of evidence comes from comparative anatomy. Look at a chimpanzee. Really look at one. Under that dark fur, their skin is pale, almost white. The hair isn't just decation. It's protection from the sun, insulation against cold nights, a barrier against insects and parasites. Now, look at human skin color distribution. The darkest skin pigmentation appears in populations that have lived near the equator for the longest time. This is a clue, a big one. If our ancestors had kept their fur, they wouldn't have needed dark skin. The hair would have provided protection from UV radiation. The fact that populations developed dark skin after losing their hair tells us the hair loss came first and the pigmentation adaptation came later. But what exactly did that ancestral fur do for our early ancestors? Why was it so important that every primate species kept it for millions of years? Let's start with thermorelation. Fur is one of nature's most sophisticated climate control systems. It works both ways, keeping heat in when it's cold, keeping heat out when it's hot. Those dense layers of hair trap air close to the skin, creating an insulating barrier that moderates temperature changes. On a cold night in the African forest when temperatures could drop to 50 degrees F or lower, that fur would have been the difference between comfortable sleep and dangerous hypothermia. But it wasn't just about staying warm. In the heat of the day, properly maintained fur actually helps keep you cool. The hair creates a barrier between directly sunlight and the skin, preventing the body directly. Watch a lion or a wolf in the summer. They don't lose their coats. The fur shades their skin, allowing air circulation underneath, while blocking the most intense heat. Our ancestors' fur would have worked the same way as long as they stayed in forested environments, with plenty of shade and limited their activity during the hottest parts of the day. Fur was a net positive. It protected them without overheating them. Then there's physical protection. Primate fur isn't soft and fluffy like a rabbit's. It's coarse, sometimes dense enough to deflect teeth. Horns prevent insect bites, cushion minor impacts when you're moving through thick vegetation, climbing trees with rough bark, sitting on rough ground. That layer of hair prevents countless small injuries that could lead to infections. And in a world before antibiotics, before even basic first aid, infection was a death sentence. Anything that prevented wounds was selected for strongly. Parasites were another major concern. This seems counterintuitive. We tend to think of fur as harboring parasites, and it can, but well-maintained primate fur actually provides a first line of defense. The hair creates a physical barrier that makes it harder for ticks, mites, and other ectoparasites to reach the skin. Modern great apes spend hours every day grooming, picking through each other's fur to remove parasites and debris. This isn't just hygienic, it's social. Grooming bonds strengthen group cohesion, establish hierarchies, maintain alliances. For our furry ancestors, that coat of hair was the foundation of their entire social system. And speaking of social systems, fur provided crucial communication functions. Primate hair isn't uniform. It forms patterns, highlights, color variations that help individuals recognize each other. It can be raised when an animal is angry or frightened, making them look larger and more threatening. It changes texture and appearance with age, providing visible signals about an individual's maturity and health status. Chimpanzees have distinctive facial hair patterns, lighter colored beards, expressive eyebrow regions. Gorillas develop silver backs as they mature, a clear signal of dominance and breeding status. Our ancestors almost certainly had similar markings, hair patterns that help them navigate complex social hierarchies without constant conflict. So when did we start losing all this functional, socially important, protective body hair? The honest answer is we don't know exactly. Hair doesn't fossilize. You can't dig up a 3-million-year-old skeleton and tell whether it was furry or naked, but we can make educated guesses based on indirect evidence. And those guesses point to a surprisingly recent timeline. The earliest hominid species like Sahelanthropus and Ororori, who lived 6 to 7 million years ago, were almost certainly fully furred. They lived in forests, moved like other apes, faced the same environmental challenges. No reason to lose the hair. Even Australopithecus species, who lived from about 4 to 2 million years ago, probably retained most of their body hair. They were spending more time on the ground, walking upright more consistently, but they were still relatively small-bodied, still living in mixed woodland and savanna environments where fur would have been advantageous. The shift probably began somewhere between 2 and 1. 5 million years ago, with the emergence of the genus Homo. Early Homo species like Homo habilis and Homo erectus showed significant changes in body proportions. They were taller, more linear with longer legs relative to their torsos. This is a body plan optimized for efficient walking and heat dissipation in open environments. And here's where things get interesting. When you commit to a tall linear body plan, adapted for hot open environments, fur starts becoming a liability. The genetic evidence supports this timeline. Studies of the genes responsible for skin pigmentation suggest that dark skin evolved somewhere between 1-2 million and 1-8 million years ago. This matters because, as we mentioned earlier, dark skin only becomes necessary after you lose the protective hair. The UV radiation that pale skin under fur could safely handle becomes dangerous when that fur disappears. Natural selection would have strongly favored darker pigmentation as soon as hair loss exposed the CO, akin to direct sunlight. By the time Homo heidelbergensis appeared, around 700,000 years ago, our ancestors were probably mostly hairless, not completely. They almost certainly retained head hair, which protected the brain from overheating and sun damage. They kept eyebrows, which channel sweat away from the eyes. They maintained eyelashes, which protect against dust and debris. They likely had some body hair, particularly in areas associated with scent glands like the armpits and groin. But the dense primate standard body hair was gone. Our ancestors had become, by primate standards, bizarrely naked. And this transformation would change everything, because losing our fur didn't just change how we looked. It changed how we hunted, how we regulated body temperature, how we dealt with parasites, how we signaled socially, even how we thought about clothing and shelter. Those remnants we still carry. The hair on our heads, our eyebrows, our eyebrows, our eyebrows, our eyebrows, our eyelashes, the variable patterns of body hair that differ between individuals and populations. Each patch of hair we retain serves a specific function. Head hair protects the brain, the body's most heat-sensitive organ, from both overheating and hypothermia. Eyebrows keep salt-laden sweat from running into our eyes during exertion. Eyelashes protect against airborne particles. The hair in our armpits and groin helps disperse pheromones, chemical signals that still play a role in human attraction and social bonding. We are in essence, strategically, hairless. We lost the fur where it would have prevented effective cooling, but kept it where it served crucial protective or signaling functions. This wasn't random. This was natural selection operating with surgical precision over hundreds of thousands of years. But this raises the obvious question: why? Why would evolution strip away a system that had worked perfectly for millions of years? What environmental pressure could have been strong enough to override all those advantages that fur provided? What changed in our ancestors' lives that made hairlessness, with all its apparent vulnerabilities, actually advantageous? That's what we need to explore next. The theories about why we lost our fur, and I promise you, some of them are stranger than you might imagine. So, now we come to the big question. The Savannah hypothesis, running under the African sun. When exactly did humans lose their fur? And more importantly, why? Because here's the thing about body hair. It's not just decoration. Every mammal on Earth has it for good reasons. It protects against sunburn, provides insulation, helps regulate temperature, and offers a barrier against parasites and injuries. Evolution doesn't just throw away useful adaptations on a whim. Something significant had to happen to make hairlessness more advantageous than keeping our fur. And for decades, the most popular explanation has been what scientists call the Savannah hypothesis. The story goes like this. Between 6 and 7 million years ago, our ancestors were living comfortable lives in the forests of Africa. They were covered in thick body hair, just like modern chimpanzees and gorillas. They spent their days moving through trees, eating fruits, leaves, and whatever small animals they could catch. Life was good. Then the climate changed. This wasn't a sudden catastrophe like the bottleneck we discussed earlier. This was a slow, grinding transformation that took millions of years. Africa was getting drier, forests were shrinking, and in their place, vast grasslands were spreading across the continent. These weren't the tidy lawns you see in suburban neighborhoods. These were wild savas, open territories where tall grasses waved in the hot wind, where scattered trees provided occasional shade, and where the temperature during midday could reach absolutely brutal levels. Our ancestors had a choice. They could retreat with the forests, staying in the shrinking woodland patches and competing ever more desperately for limited resources, or they could adapt to the new environment, learning to survive in the open grasslands where no tree-dwelling ape had gone before. Some populations chose the first option. They stayed in the forests and eventually became modern chimpanzees and bonobos. But one lineage, our lineage, took the risk. They moved out into the open. And this decision changed everything. The savannah wasn't like the forest. In the trees you could move from one shady spot to another, rarely exposing yourself to direct sunlight for long periods. But out on the grasslands, there was nowhere to hide from the sun. If you wanted to find food, you had to walk for miles under brutal heat. If you wanted to hunt, you had to chase prey across open ground with no shade breaks. And here's where the problem with fur becomes obvious. Body hair is great, insulation when you need to stay warm. But when you're exercising in 100 degrees heat, it becomes a death trap. Fur traps heat close to your body, preventing it from dissipating into the air. Modern chimpanzees deal with this by avoiding midday activity. They rest in the shade during the hottest hours, only moving around during cooler morning and evening periods. But our ancestors couldn't afford that luxury because around the same time they were moving into the savannahs, they were developing something revolutionary. Bipedalism, walking upright on two legs. This adaptation is usually explained in terms of efficiency. Walking on two legs uses less energy than knuckle walking on all fours, letting you cover more ground with less effort. But bipedalism had another crucial advantage that's often overlooked. It reduced sun exposure. And a chimpanzee walks on all fours. Its entire back is exposed to direct overhead sunlight. That's a huge surface area, absorbing solar radiation. But when you stand upright, only your head and shoulders get hit by the midday sun. Everything else is shielded by your own body. This reduces heat load by about 60%. That's enormous. But even with reduced sun exposure, the savannah was still brutally hot. And this is where hairlessness enters the picture. Our ancestors needed a better cooling system, and nature had already provided the solution. Sweating. Now, lots of animals sweat, but most mammals only have sweat glands in limited locations like their paws, and the sweat glands they do have are called epochine glands, which produce that's great for scent communication, but pretty useless for cooling. Humans are different. We're covered in eccrine sweat glands, millions of them distributed across our entire body. These glands produce thin, watery sweat that evaporates quickly, carrying heat away from the skin with incredible efficiency. It's one of the most effective cooling systems in the animal kingdom. But here's the crucial detail. Eccrine sweat glands only work efficiently on bare skin. If you're covered in thick fur, the sweat gets trapped in the hair, where it just sits there being useless instead of evaporating and cooling you down. So the hypothesis goes like this. As our ancestors adapted to savanna life and developed bipedalism, natural selection began favoring individuals with less body hair and more eccrine sweat glands. These individuals could stay active during the hottest parts of the day. They could walk further to find food. They could hunt more effectively. Most importantly, they could practice what anthropologists call persistence hunting. This was the game share, the hunting strategy that might have driven human evolution more than any other factor. Here's how it worked. You pick out a target animal, usually something like an antelope or a kudu. Then you just start jogging after it. Not sprinting, just a steady jog. The animal bolts, running at full speed until it's far ahead of you. But you keep jogging. Eventually, you catch up again. The animal runs away again. You keep jogging over and over for hours, sometimes for an entire day. The animal is faster than you in short bursts, but it can't sweat effectively. It can only cool down by panting, which means it has to stop running to catch its breath. Meanwhile, you're cooling down continuously through evaporative sweating. You never have to stop. You can jog for hours without overheating. Eventually, the animal simply collapses from heat exhaustion. Its internal temperature rises to dangerous levels. Its muscles stop working properly, and you walk up and kill it with a spear or a rock. It sounds brutal because it is, but it's also remarkably effective. Modern hunter-gatherers in the Kalahari Desert still practice persistence hunting, and they can bring down animals that would be impossible to catch any other way. And this hunting strategy only works if you're hairless and covered in eccrine sweat glands. With fur, you'd overheat and collapse long before your prey did. Without fur, you become the most dangerous long-distance predator on the planet. The paleoclimate evidence supports this scenario. Between 3 and 4 million years ago, we see a dramatic expansion of grasslands across East Africa. This matches perfectly with the fossil record, showing our ancestors developing bipedalism and leaving the forests. By 2 million years ago, we have early Homo species that show clear adaptations for long distances running, including changed leg proportions, modified foot architecture, articature, and enlarged buttock muscles for stabilizing the trunk during running. These are the bodies of persistence hunters, and they would have needed hairlessness to make the strategy work. But there's more to the story. Hairlessness wasn't just about hunting. It was about surviving in a completely new environment where the old rules didn't apply. In the forest, overheating was rarely a problem, but dehydration was constant because water sources were scattered and unreliable. Our savanna-adapted ancestors needed to travel long distances between waterholes, often carrying food or tools with them. This meant hours of walking in direct sunlight. Without an efficient cooling system, this would have been impossible. With hairlessness and eccrine sweating, it became routine. The genetic evidence adds another piece to the puzzle. Studies of skin pigmentation genes suggest that humans developed dark skin around 1.2 million years ago, right around the time we are losing most of our body hair. This makes perfect sense. Body hair protect against UV radiation. Once you lose that protection, you need something else to prevent skin damage and skin cancer. Dark skin loaded with melanin pigment that absorbs and scatters UV rays provided that protection. So the sequence probably went like this. Savannah adaptation, then bipedalism, then gradual hair loss combined with increased sweating capacity, then darker skin pigmentation to protect newly exposed skin from sun damage, each adaptation building on the previous ones, creating a complete package optimized for surviving in open, hot environments. But as compelling as the Savannah hypothesis sounds, it's not without problems. The biggest criticism is that the timeline doesn't quite match up. We know our ancestors were bipedal by about 4 million years ago, but the most dramatic reduction in body hair probably didn't happen until much later, maybe 1 to 2 million years ago. That's a huge gap. If hairlessness was immediately advantageous for a bipedal savanna living, why did it take millions of years to evolve? Some researchers suggest the early bipedal hominins might have retained their fur because they were still living partially in woodland environments only, moving into fully open savas much later. Others think hairlessness might have evolved in stages with different body regions losing hair at different times and for different reasons. Another problem is that not all populations living in hot open environments are hairless. Aboriginal Australians lived in conditions very similar to the African savanna for tens of thousands of years, but they retained normal human body hair patterns. They didn't evolve to become more hairy, just because the savanna hypothesis suggests hairlessness is optimal for those environments. This suggests that once hairlessness evolved, it became fixed in human populations, regardless of local climate conditions, which means maybe it wasn't purely about savanna adaptation after all. Then there's the question of persistence, hunting itself. While it's true that some modern hunter-gatherers practice this technique, it's far from universal. Many successful hunting societies have never used persistence hunting at all, so maybe it wasn't as important to human evolution as the hypothesis suggests. Maybe hairlessness evolved for different reasons and persistence hunting was just a useful side benefit that some populations figured out how to exploit. Despite these criticisms, the savanna hypothesis remains the most widely accepted explanation for human hairlessness. It connects multiple lines of evidence into a coherent narrative: climate change driving habitat change favoring bipedalism, bipedalism creating thermal challenges selecting for hairlessness, then improved sweating. Each step follows logically from the previous on, and the end result, hairless, sweating, long-distance running humans, matches exactly what we see in the fossil and genetic records. But science is never about finding one perfect explanation and calling it done. It's about testing hypotheses, identifying problems and refining our understanding. The savanna hypothesis might explain much of human hairlessness, but it probably isn't the whole story. Other factors, other selective pressures, other evolutionary forces were almost certainly involved. And that's what makes this mystery so fascinating. We're not just asking why humans lost their fur. We're asking what it means to be human. How did we become this strange, hairless, sweating species that can run for hours under the blazing sun? What combination of environmental pressures and random mutations and selective advantages created something so unique in the mammalian world? The savanna hypothesis gives us part of the answer, but only part. The full story is more complex, more nuanced, and far more interesting than any single explanation can capture. The basic idea goes like this. Sometime the aquatic ape theory, a controversial water-based explanation, between 7 and 8 million years ago, our ancestors weren't living on the African savanna. They were living along coastlines and estuaries, spending significant time in shallow water, not as fully aquatic creatures like dolphins or seals, but as semi-aquatic primates who waded through tidal pools, foraged for shellfish, and used water as a refuge from predators. And during this aquatic phase, they lost their fur. The theory was first proposed by marine biologist Alistair Hardy in 1960, then developed extensively by writer Elaine Morgan starting in the 1970s. And from the moment it was published, the scientific establishment hated it. Speculative, unfalsifiable, based on superficial similarities rather than solid evidence. But here's the thing. Morgan and Hardy were asking legitimate questions, questions that mainstream theory struggled to answer satisfactorily. Start with the most obvious one. Why are Homo, we're humans the only primates without fur? Every other ape, gorillas, chimps, orangutans, they're all covered in thick body hair, but humans were basically naked. Now, the Savannah hypothesis says we lost our fur to stay cool while running in open grasslands. But plenty of savanna mammals have fur. Zebras, wildebeest, lions, they all manage just fine with full coats. So why did only humans need to become naked? The aquatic ape theory offers a different answer. Look at aquatic mammals. Dolphins, whales, hippos, manatees. What do they all have in common? They're hairless, or nearly hairless. Marine mammals lose their fur because it becomes a liability in water. Wet fur loses its insulating properties, creates drag when swimming, and traps water against the skin, causing heat loss. Far better to lose the fur entirely and develop other adaptations like thick subcutaneous fat. And this is where the theory gets interesting, because humans are weird among primates. We have a layer of fat directly beneath our skin that's far thicker than any other ape. Chimps and gorillas are basically all muscle. Their skin sits right against their muscle tissue, with minimal fat in between. But humans, even lean humans, have a significant layer of subcutaneous fat. Babies are born chubby with fat reserves that seem excessive for a terrestrial mammal. You know what other mammals have extensive subcutaneous fat? Aquatic worms, seals, whales, hippos. They use this fat layer for insulation in water, where fur won't work. The fat provides buoyancy, helps with temperature regulation, and serves as an energy reserve during long periods of swimming or diving. Humans have exactly this adaptation, a layer of fat that seems designed for an aquatic lifestyle. Then there's breath control. Humans are the only primates who can consciously control their breathing. Chimps can't do it. Gorillas can't do it. Try to teach a chimpanzee to hold its breath or blow out a candle. It can't figure out what you want. But human babies can hold their breath underwater from birth. It's an instinctive response. You dunk a newborn in water, they automatically seal their airways and stop breathing. This is called the bradyardic response, and it's strongest in infants. Exactly. When it would be most useful if our ancestors were semi-aquatic. Adult humans can train themselves to hold their breath for minutes at a time. Free divers regularly go 4, 5, even 10 minutes without breathing. This isn't normal for a terrestrial mammal, but it's completely normal for semi-aquatic ones. Otters, seals, hippos, they all have sophisticated breath control that lets them forage underwater. Humans have this ability too, which seems strange if we evolved entirely on dry land. The theory goes further. Consider our body shape. Humans have relatively long legs compared to other apes. Our legs are built for forward motion, bipedal, striding, but they're also pretty good for wading through shallow water. Stand a human, a chimp, and a gorilla in chest-deep water and watch what happens. The chimp and gorilla panic, struggling to keep their heads above water. The human instinctively stands upright, walks forward, uses the water to support their body weight. It feels natural because our proportions are adapted for it. Or look at our hands. Human hands have partially webbed fingers. Not dramatically webbed like a duck's foot, but there's definitely a membrane connecting the base of each finger. Other apes don't have this. Their fingers are separate almost to the base. Why would humans have vestigial webbing if we'd never spent time in water? The theory even tries to explain human babies' relationship with water. Human infants are born helpless, unable to cling to their mothers the way other ape babies can. Put a newborn chimp on its mother's chest. It'll grab her fur and hold on. Put a newborn human on their mother's chest. They slide right off. We lack the gripping reflex that all other primates have. But human babies are natural swimmers. From birth, they can coordinate their limbs in a swimming motion, hold their breath underwater, and seem remarkably comfortable in aquatic environments, as if that's where we evolved to spend our earliest months. Morgan and Hardy even proposed specific geographic locations for this aquatic phase. They suggested the East African Rift Valley during a period when it was flooded by lakes and inland seas, or the shores of the Mediterranean where sea levels fluctuated dramatically, or coastal regions of Africa where early hominins might have exploited rich marine resources, places where our ancestors could have waded through shallow waters, diving for shellfish, catching fish in tidal pools, using the water as protection from terrestrial predators. The archaeological record does show that early humans exploited aquatic resources extensively. Shell mittens, massive piles of discarded shellfish shells appear at human sites. Going back hundreds of thousands of years, coastal populations seem to have relied heavily on marine resources. Some researchers think the omega-3 fatty acids from seafood might have been crucial for brain development, providing the nutritional foundation for our large, metabolically expensive brains. But here's where the theory falls apart. Despite decades of searching, nobody's found the smoking gun. No fossils of semi-aquatic hominins with obvious acuity. Sea adaptations, no skeletal features that clearly indicate diving or swimming. No deposits of human remains in ancient lake beds or coastal sites that would confirm prolonged aquatic living. The fossil record, sparse as it is, shows early humans in savanna environments, not aquatic ones. The mainstream scientific community has been brutal in its rejection of the aquatic ape theory. Paleoanthropologists point out that every supposed aquatic adaptation can be explained other ways. Hairlessness for thermorelation on open grasslands, subcutaneous fat for energy storage during periods of food scarcity, breath control as a byproduct of speech development, bipedalism for efficient long-distance walking, not wing. Each individual piece of evidence crumbles under scrutiny. The theory also has a methodological problem. It cherry-picks similarities between humans and aquatic mammals, while ignoring all the ways we're different. We don't have flippers. We don't have streamlined body shapes. We don't have the massive lung capacity of diving mammals. We don't have salt glands for excreting excess salt from seawater. We don't have any of the dozens of specific adaptations that true aquatic mammals possess. The similarities are superficial, the kind of convergent evolution you'd expect from any mammal that spent time in water, not evidence of a dedicated aquatic phase, lasting millions of years. Most damningly, the theory requires a massive gap in the fossil record. If humans spent millions of years as semi-aquatic creatures, where are the transitional fossils? Where are the proto-humans with intermediate adaptations? The fossil record isn't complete, but it's not that incomplete. We found fossils of early hominins in all sorts of environments. None of them show clear aquatic specializations. Yet the theory won't die. It keeps coming back, keeps attracting supporters, keeps generating debate. Why? Because it explains certain things so elegantly. The hairlessness, the fat, the breath control, the ease with which humans take to water. Babies who can swim before they can walk. Adults who can train themselves to free dive to extraordinary depths. Populations around the world who live almost amphibious lifestyles, spending hours each day in water. Maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle. Maybe our ancestors weren't fully aquatic, but they weren't fully terrestrial either. Maybe they were what ecologists call facultative aquatic animals, creatures equally comfortable on land and in water, exploiting resources from both environments. Early humans living along lake shores and coastlines, wading through shallows to gather shellfish, diving for sea urchins, catching fish in tidal pools, not spending enough time in water to become truly aquatic, but enough to lose their fur and develop some water-friendly adaptations. There's some genetic evidence for this compromised position. Studies of human populations that have lived by water for thousands of years show adaptations for diving and swimming. The Baja people of Southeast Asia, who spend up to 5 hours a day underwater fishing, have evolved larger spleens that store oxygenated blood, allowing longer dive times. This suggests humans can adapt to aquatic lifestyles relatively quickly, and that such adaptations might have occurred repeatedly throughout our evolutionary history. So maybe the aquatic ape theory isn't entirely wrong. Maybe it's just overstated. Maybe our ancestors did spend migdicnant time in and around water enough to influence our evolution, in subtle but important ways. Not enough to turn us into seals or dolphins, but enough to make us the only apes who can swim naturally, hold our breath consciously, and walk upright through chastity water without panic. The scientific community still rejects the theory in its strong form, but elements of it, the recognition that early humans exploited aquatic resources extensively, that water may have played a bigger role in our evolution than previously thought. These ideas are slowly being incorporated into mainstream thinking, not as a replacement for Savannah hypothesis, but as a complement, a recognition that human evolution was complex, multifaceted, influenced by many environments and many selective pressures, because that's how evolution actually works, not through single dramatic adaptations, but through gradual accumulation of changes driven by complex environmental pressures. Maybe we didn't need to be fully aquatic to lose our fur. Maybe we just needed to spend enough time in water that hairlessness became advantageous, combined with heat stress on Savannah, combined with parasite pressure, combined with social signaling, combined with a dozen other factors we haven't even considered yet. Human hairlessness probably doesn't have a single simple explanation. It's the product of multiple evolutionary pressures, working together over millions of years. The aquatic ape theory, controversial as it is, reminds us to look beyond the obvious answers, to consider all the environments our ancestors inhabited, all the challenges they faced. Because the truth is always more complicated than any single theory can capture. But parasites and disease, the hygiene hypothesis. There's another possibility, one that's less romantic than running across sunlit savas, less controversial than swimming in ancient lakes. It's grittier, more disturbing, and possibly more important than any other explanation for why we lost our fur. Parasites. Not the most pleasant topic for a bedtime story, but stay with me here, because what lives in fur might have been the real driving force behind human hairlessness, and the evidence is written in the DNA of creatures so small you'd need a microscope to see them. Yet, so deadly they've killed more humans than all the wars in history combined. Let's start with something simple. You're a human ancestor living 2 million years ago. You're covered in fur just like your chimp relatives, and that fur is home to an entire ecosystem of creatures that see you as their personal planet. Lice crawling through the thick hair on your scalp and body, laying eggs that hatch into more lice. Ticks burrowing into your skin, wherever the fur is thick enough to hide them from your picking fingers. Fleas jumping from individual to individual whenever your group huddles together for warmth. Mites living in hair follicles feeding on oils and dead skin. And these aren't just annoying, they're deadly. Because here's the thing about fur-dwelling parasites. They don't just make you itch, they carry diseases. Typhus spread by body lice has killed millions. Plague carried by fleas has wiped out entire civilizations. Lyme disease delivered by ticks can damage your heart, your nervous system, your joints. In tropical environments where your ancestors lived, the parasite load on furred mammals is staggering. Modern primates in equatorial Africa can carry dozens of different parasite species simultaneously, each one draining energy, transmitting pathogens, reducing the host's ability to survive and reproduce. Now, imagine you're a member of an early human group trying to transition from forest living to open savanna environments. You're spending more time in the sun, you're walking upright through tall grasses where ticks wait to drop onto passing animals. You're starting to live in larger social groups, sleeping close together, which means parasites can spread faster than ever before. And you're developing the cognitive capacity to notice patterns, to observe that some individuals seem healthier than others, that some people are constantly scratching, clearly infested, while others have clearer skin. Natural selection is brutal in these situations. It doesn't care about your feelings or your comfort. It only cares about reproduction. And if parasites are reducing your health, making you weak, giving you fever, covering you in sores, you're less likely to survive long enough to have children. Even if you do survive, you're less attractive as a potential mate. This is where the hygiene hypothesis gets interesting. Some anthropologists argue that the loss of body hair wasn't primarily about cooling or swimming. It was about creating an environment where parasites couldn't thrive. Think about the difference between a furred surface and bare skin. Fur provides insulation, darkness, humidity, countless hiding places. It's the perfect habitat for lice, which need to stay attached to hair shafts to survive. It's ideal for ticks, which can burrow deep and feed for days without being detected. It's heaven for fleas, which can lay eggs in the thick undergrowth and jump between posts easily. Bare skin, by contrast, is a hostile environment for parasites. No place to hide, no hair shafts to grip. Any tick or louse on bare skin is immediately visible and vulnerable to being picked off. The sun directly hits the skin, creating temperatures too high for many parasites to survive. Rain washes away eggs and larvae that would otherwise be protected by fur. The selection pressure would have been intense. Individuals with less body hair would have lower parasite loads. They'd be healthier, more energetic, better able to hunt and gather. They'd have fewer disease outbreaks. Crucially, they'd be more attractive to potential mates because visible health became easier to assess. This is sexual selection at its most pragmatic. You're not looking for the most colorful plumage or the most elaborate display. You're looking for clear skin, smooth, parasite-free skin that signals a healthy immune system and low disease risk. In environments where parasites are a major cause of death and disability, choosing a mate with visible evidence of parasite resistance could be the difference between your children surviving or dying young. The genetic evidence supports this timeline. In fascinating ways, we know humans have 3 types of lice: head lice, which live in scalp hair; body lice, which live in clothing and only visit skin to feed; and pubic lice, which are actually more closely related to gorilla lice than to other human lice. The DNA of these life species tells us when they diverge from each other, which gives us a timeline for when humans lost body hair and when we invented clothing. Body lice DNA suggests they split from head lice somewhere between 70,000 and 170,000 years ago. That's when body lice evolved to live in clothing rather than body hair, because there wasn't any body hair left to live in. This means humans had already lost most of their body hair by this point and had started wearing clothes regularly enough that lice could adapt to this new habitat. Head lice DNA is much older, suggesting they've been with us for millions of years, continuously living in our scalp hair. The fact that we kept head hair but lost body hair is actually strong evidence for the parasite hypothesis. Head hair could be groomed by other group members. Social grooming, where individuals pick through each other's hair, removing parasites, is a major behavior in all primates. It's practical, it's bonding, and it works. But you can't effectively groom your own back, your own legs, your entire body surface. That fur was harboring parasites you couldn't reach. By losing body hair but keeping head hair, early humans created a situation where parasites were confined to a navigable area that could be systematically groomed, while eliminating the vast habitat that had existed across the rest of the body. It's actually an elegant compromise. Keep the benefits of hair, protection from sun on the head, possibly sexual signaling, while eliminating the massive parasite burden of full-body fur. The relationship between hair loss and group living intensifies this effect. As human populations began living in larger, more permanent groups, parasite transmission became a more serious problem. When you're a small band of 15 people moving frequently, parasites have limited opportunities to spread. But when you're a group of 50 or 100 people living in the same location for months, sleeping in close proximity, sharing food and tools, parasites can spread explosively. Modern studies of parasite loads in different mammal species show clear patterns. Species that live in large social groups and have thick fur suffer much higher parasite burdens than solitary species or hairless species. Bats living in caves with thousands of individuals are absolutely covered in parasites. Prairie dogs in large colonies have high tick and flea loads. Primates living in big troops show more parasite diversity and density than solitary primates. Humans were moving in the direction of larger groups, denser populations, more social complexity. Every step toward bigger communities increased the selective pressure against body hair. Every generations, the individuals with less hair were slightly healthier. Their children survived at slightly higher rates. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this cumulative pressure stripped away the fur that our ancestors had carried for millions of years. There's even evidence that hairlessness correlates with reduced disease transmission in modern contexts. Studies comparing infection rates between body regions show that hairy areas, armpits, groin, are more prone to bacterial and fungal infections than hairless areas. The warm, moist environment created by hair provides ideal conditions for pathogens. Historical records show that soldiers who shaved body hair in tropical environments had lower rates of certain diseases than those who didn't. Of course, losing hair created new problems. Without fur, humans became vulnerable to sunburn, heat loss at night, and injuries from vegetation and insects. But these costs were apparently worth the benefits of reduced parasite load. And humans solved these new problems with technology. Clothing for warmth and protection. Shelter for avoiding sun and rain. Fire for warmth during cold nights. Tools for processing food that might have become harder to eat without the jaw strength that often correlates with fur coverage. The parasite hypothesis also explains some puzzling details about human body hair distribution. We didn't lose all our hair. We kept significant hair in the armpits and groin, areas that coincidentally produce strong scent signals from apocrine glands. This suggests that hair in these regions might have been retained for social signaling, chemical communication, that was important enough to outweigh the parasite costs. We also kept our eyelashes and eyebrows, which serve clear protective functions for our eyes. These hairs are coarse, regularly shed, and much less hospitable to parasites than the fine, dense body fur of our ancestors. They protect without harboring the ecosystem of bugs that body fur supported. And we kept, as mentioned, our head hair, which could be long and thick, but head hair is unique. It's the one area of the body where other group members can effectively help with parasite control. Social grooming of head hair became a major bonding behavior in human societies, something we still see echoes of in hair styling, haircuts, and the intimacy of touching someone's hair. The timing of hair loss, probably between 1 and 2 million years ago, based on genetic evidence from skin pigmentation genes, coincides with other major transitions in human evolution. This is when brain size is increasing rapidly, when tool use is becoming sophisticated, when group sizes are growing, when humans are spreading into new environments with different parasite pressures. It's possible, maybe even likely, that hair loss was part of a package of adaptations that all reinforced each other. Bigger brains needed better cooling, which hairlessness provided. Larger groups needed better parasite control, which hairlessness enabled. More sophisticated social structures benefited from visible health signals, which bare skin revealed. Better tool use allowed clothing manufacture, which compensated for the loss of fur's protective functions. None of these factors alone might have been enough to drive the evolution of hairlessness, but together they created a situation where losing fur provided multiple simultaneous advantages. Parasites might not have been the only reason we lost our hair, but they were probably a major part of the equation. A constant, deadly evolutionary pressure that shaped our bodies in ways we're still living with today. Every time you look at your smooth arm or leg, you're seeing the result of millions of years of warfare against creatures so small you can barely see them. Creatures that once called your ancestors for home. Creatures that our lineage eventually evicted by burning down the house. But let's step back from the drama of thermoregulation and the sweating revolution, bottlenecks, and survival for a moment, because there's another revolution happening in the background of this story. Something so fundamental to what makes us human that we barely notice it anymore. Something that's literally dripping off your body right now if you're doing anything more strenuous than lying perfectly still in an air-conditioned room. I'm talking about sweat. Here's the thing. You are covered, absolutely covered, in somewhere between 2 and 4 million specialized glands whose sole purpose is to produce salty water and squirt it onto your skin surface. That might sound gross, but it's actually one of the most sophisticated cooling systems ever evolved by any mammal on Earth. And it only works because you're naked. Let me explain why this matters so much. Every mammal faces the same fundamental problem. Bodies generate heat, muscles working, hearts pumping, brains thinking. All of this produces thermal energy that has to go somewhere. For most mammals, this isn't a huge deal. They can pant, seek shade, reduce activity during the hottest parts of the day. But for the human ancestors spreading across Africa during and after the bottleneck, The bottleneck, the heat problem, was becoming critical because they weren't just surviving anymore. They were endlessly walking, tracking game animals, searching for water, moving between seasonal food sources, and they were doing it under the African sun in the middle of the day when every other predator had the good sense to rest in the shade. This created a metabolic crisis. Walking generates about 4 times as much heat as resting. Walking under direct sunlight adds the entire radiant heat load of the sun. Walking in pursuit of game that can run faster than you means maintaining this activity level for hours, maybe all day. Do that in a fur coat and you die. Not might die, will die. Hypothermia, heat stroke, organ failure. Your brain cooks inside your skull before you catch anything worth eating. Evolution had a choice to make. Either humans stay hairy and accept the limitations that come with it, restricted activity, periods, shorter pursuit distances, less vicious hunting strategies, or humans lose the hair and develop something better. They developed something better. The human sweating system is genuinely extraordinary. Other mammals have sweat glands, sure, but they're usually concentrated in specific areas, paw pads, or around the nose. They're used for traction or scent marking more than cooling. Humans are different. We have eccrine sweat glands distributed across almost every square inch of our body surface. Your forehead alone has about 200 sweat glands per square kd. Your back, your chest, your arms, your legs, all covered in these microscopic thermal management factories. And here's the really clever part. These glands don't just produce water. They produce a carefully calibrated mixture of water, salt, and other dissolved substances that's been optimized for evaporative cooling efficiency. When this sweat reaches your skin surface and evaporates, it removes heat, a lot of heat. Every gram of water that evaporates from your skin removes about 580 calories of thermal energy. Not food calories, thermal calories, but still it's an enormous cooling effect. For this system to work, the sweat has to reach your skin surface and evaporate into the surrounding air. And here's where fur becomes a problem. Thick body hair creates a microclimate next to your skin, a layer of trapped air that's warm, humid, and relatively still. Sweat that evaporates in this microclimate doesn't cool you efficiently because the heat energy isn't being carried away. It just sits there, raising the humidity in your fur layer until evaporation slows to a crawl. You end up soaking wet and still overheating. Remove the fur, though, and everything changes. Sweat reaches bare skin. Airflow across that skin carries away the evaporated moisture immediately. The cooling effect is dramatic. Studies show that naked humans can maintain comfortable body temperatures during exercise in conditions that would quickly incapacitate furred mammals of similar size. This wasn't just convenient. This was transformative, because suddenly your ancestors could hunt in ways that were impossible for almost any other predator. They developed what anthropologists call persistence hunting. You find a herd of antelope, you start walking toward them at a steady pace. They run away. Obviously, they're much faster than you, but they're covered in fur. They can sprint, but they can't cool down while moving. After a few minutes, they have to stop and pant, standing in whatever shade they can find, trying to bring their body temperature back down. While they are stopped, you keep walking. You don't run. You just walk, steady, relentless. Hour after hour, the antelope see you coming and run again. Stop again to cool down. Run again. And you just keep walking. Your eccrine sweat glands are pumping out moisture. Your bare skin is evaporating it efficiently. Your body temperature stays stable. After 6, 8, maybe 12 hours of this, the antelope collapses. Its cooling system has failed. It's in heat stroke, unable to run anymore, and you walk up and kill it with your spear. This sounds almost like science fiction, but it's not. Modern persistence hunters in the Kalahari Desert still use these techniques. They can run down kudu, one of the fastest antelopes in Africa, in the middle of the day, in temperatures that would kill most predators. They do it because they're naked and they can sweat, but evolution doesn't give gifts without costs. The same hair loss that made this incredible cooling system possible created new vulnerabilities. Fur isn't just insulation against cold, it's also protection against sunlight. The African sun at midday delivers about 1000 W of radiant energy per square meter. That's like standing under 1,000 W light bulbs. Except these light bulbs include ultraviolet radiation that damages DNA and causes skin cancer. Hairy mammals don't worry much about this. Their fur absorbs and reflects most of the UV before it reaches the pack. Naked humans, though, they needed a different solution. They developed dark skin. Melanin, the pigment that gives skin its color, is nature's sunscreen. It absorbs UV radiation before it can damage the DNA in skin cells. The more melanin you have, the darker your skin, and the better protected you are from solar radiation. This is why all early humans had dark skin. Not some of them, all of them. Every human living in Africa during and after the bottleneck would have had skin as dark as the darkest modern Africans. It was a survival requirement. Lose your fur in equatorial Africa without developing dark skin, and you're selecting yourself out of the gene pool. Fast, skin cancer, yes, but also acute sunburn damage that interferes with that crucial sweating function. Natural selection wouldn't tolerate that. So the package evolved together: less body hair, more sweat glands, darker skin, each adaptation reinforcing the others, creating a thermal management system that had never existed before in mammalian evolution. And this system had another unexpected benefit. It helped solve one of the biggest challenges facing human evolution: the brain problem. Your brain is an energy hog, 3 pounds of tissue consuming about 20% of your body's total energy budget. But energy consumption means heat production. Your brain generates about 15 watts of thermal energy continuously just from thinking, remembering, processing sensory information. That's like having a small light bulb burning inside your skull 24/7. Most mammals keep their brain temperatures slightly lower than their core body temperature. They use specialized blood vessel structures in the nasal passages to cool blood before it reaches the brain. It works fine for brains that are using modest amounts of energy. But the human lineage was evolving larger and larger brains, more neurons, more connections, more metabolic activity, more heat. At some point, the standard mammalian brain cooling system wasn't going to be enough. The sweating revolution solved this. With efficient whole-body cooling, humans could maintain stable core temperatures, even during intense physical activity. This meant the brain never experienced the dangerous temperature spikes that would occur in furred animals during similar exertion. The brain could grow larger, consume more energy, generate more heat because the body's cooling system could handle it. Some researchers think this created a positive feedback loop. Better body cooling allowed larger brains. Larger brains enabled more sophisticated hunting techniques and tool use. More sophisticated hunting provided better nutrition. Better nutrition supported even larger brains, and so on, spiraling upward toward the massive brains that characterize modern humans. But there was another consequence of this sweating revolution that is often overlooked. It created new social requirements because efficient sweating requires water, a lot of water. A human engaged in moderate activity in a hot environment can lose 2 to 3 L of water per hour through sweating. That's catastrophic dehydration, unless you're constantly replacing the lost fluid. This meant human ancestors couldn't range far from water sources. They needed to know where every waterhole, stream, and seasonal spring was located in their territory. They needed to develop water storage technologies, containers made from ostrich eggs, animal bladders, anything that could carry precious water during long hunts. They needed to cooperate, sharing knowledge about water sources, helping group members who were struggling with heat stress. The humans who survived weren't just the ones with the best sweating systems. They were the ones who were smart enough and social enough to manage the constant hydration challenge that came with those systems. And here's where the story gets really interesting. Because the sweating revolution didn't just help humans survive in hot environments, it helped them thrive in ways no other mammal could match. That persistence hunting capability I mentioned earlier, it worked anywhere prey animals had to stop and pant. Hot savannas, obviously, but also temperate grasslands during summer. Even in cooler climates, a human in pursuit could outlast furred animals during the warm parts of the day. This gave human ancestors access to resources that other predators couldn't efficiently exploit. The big cats hunted in dawn and dusk ambushes. Wild dogs hunted in coordinated sprints. But humans could hunt in the middle of the day when every other predator was resting. They could pursue prey to exhaustion over distances that no sprint predator could match. They could quite literally run the biggest, fastest animals on Earth into the ground through the simple application of bare skin and sweat glands. This wasn't the only reason humans lost their fur. The other theories, parasites, sexual selection, aquatic adaptations, they all probably contributed something. Evolution rarely has single causes with complex traits. But the Thermoriation revolution, this was transformative. This was the adaptation that let humans become pursuit predators, despite being relatively slow and weak. This was what let human brains grow large without cooking inside their skulls. This was what forced human ancestors to develop sophisticated social systems for managing water resources. In short, this was one of the key innovations that made us human. And it only worked because we were willing to go naked into a world where every other mammal kept its fur coat on. But here's where the story gets sexual selection and social signaling really interesting, because all those practical explanations, running in the heat, swimming in water, avoiding parasites, they only tell part of the story. There's another force at work in human evolution, one that's often overlooked but potentially just as powerful as any environmental pressure: sexual selection. The simple fact that humans choose their mates, and those choices shape the evolution of our species, just as much as any climate disaster or predator threat. Think about it. You're a human living 800,000 years ago. The bottleneck has just ended. Your population is expanding, and for the first time in over 100,000 years, you actually have choices about who you reproduce with. There are enough people around that you're not just pairing up with whoever happens to be available. You can be selective. And what are you looking for? What signals tell you that a potential mate is healthy, strong, likely to produce successful offspring? In every other primate species, the answer is fur. A thick, glossy coat indicates good health and proper nutrition. Parasites, disease, stress, they all show up in the quality of an animal's fur. Baboons, chimps, gorillas, they all judge potential mates partly by the condition of their coats. But humans, we took the opposite path. We made the absence of fur the signal itself. 'Cause here's the thing about naked skin. It's honest. You can't fake it. You can't hide anything. Every blemish, every scar, every sign of disease or injury, it's all right there, on display. Fur is forgiving. It covers imperfections, hides problems. But smooth, exposed skin, it's a billboard advertising your genetic quality to anyone who looks. Think about what visible skin reveals. Parasites. You can see them immediately, or at least see the marks they leave. No wondering if that potential mate is carrying a load of ticks and lice under their fur. Diseases. Most of them show up on the skin before anywhere else. Rashes, lesions, discoloration. Discoloration. Here all immediately visible. Nutritional status. Healthy skin glows. Malnourished skin looks dull, flaky, aged. Scars tell stories about past injuries and how well they healed. Even age itself becomes impossible to hide. In a species where every individual matters, where losing even one person to disease or injury could threaten the survival of the entire group, being able to assess health status at a glance would be incredibly valuable. And what better way to advertise your own health than to have nothing to hide? This is sexual selection in action. If early humans began preferring mates with less body hair because it allowed better assessment of health, then individuals born with genes for reduced hairiness would have reproductive advantages. They'd have more offspring. Those offspring would inherit the reduced hairiness genes. Over hundreds of thousands of years, the preference and the trait would reinforce each other, driving human body hair toward extinction. But notice what didn't disappear. Head hair, facial hair in males, pubic and underarm hair, these patches remained, even flourished, while body hair vanished. Why? Because they serve different signaling purposes. Head hair is perhaps the most obvious. It remained thick and long enough to become one of the most distinctive features of human appearance. And it makes sense. Head hair can be styled, displayed, used as a signal of individual identity and group membership. Every human culture that's ever been studied pays attention to hairstyles. They use them to signal age, status, availability, cultural affiliation. Head hair became a canvas for social signaling precisely because the rest of the body was bare. And here's something remarkable. Human head hair is unique among primates. It keeps growing indefinitely. Chimp hair grows to a certain length and stops, same with gorillas and every other ape. But human hair, it just keeps going. Some individuals can grow hair down to their waist or beyond if they never cut it. This suggests strong selection for long head hair, probably because it was so useful for signaling. Facial hair in males tells a similar story. In most human populations, males develop thick beards during puberty. This is a testosterone-dependent trait, meaning it honestly signals male hormonal status. Females generally don't develop beards, creating a clear visual distinction between sexes. In a species that walks upright and faces each other constantly, this sexual dimorphism becomes an important social signal. Pubic and underarm hair appeared during puberty, providing a clear signal of sexual maturity. In the small groups where humans lived, being able to tell at a glance who was an adult and who was still a child would have been socially important. These hair patches acted like biological flags, saying, "I'm ready to reproduce." But the retention of hair in specific areas created something else, something that would prove crucial to human social evolution. Contrast. Patches of hair against mostly bare skin drew attention to specific body regions. The face, framed by head hair and marked by facial hair in males. The groin highlighted by pubic hair. These became focal points for social and sexual attention. And this is where hairlessness really changed everything about how humans communicate, because exposed facial skin allowed for something no other mammal could do to the same degree: nuanced facial expressions. Think about trying to read the emotions of a chimp or a dog. You can do it, but it's difficult. Their faces are covered with fur that obscures fine muscle movements. But human faces, we can detect micro-expressions lasting fractions of a second. We can distinguish dozens of different emotional states just by looking at someone's face: happiness, sadden, fear, anger, disgust, surprise, contempt, and countless subtle variations and combinations of these basic emotions. This is only possible because our faces are bare. Every tiny movement of the story stops. Every tiny movement of the muscles around the eyes, mouth, and forehead is visible. We evolved one of the most complex systems of facial communication in the animal kingdom, and it required naked skin to work. The same applies to blushing. This uniquely human trait only works because our facial skin is exposed and relatively translucent. When we experience certain emotions, embarrassment, shame, attraction, blood rushes to the face causing visible wringing. It's an involuntary signal that we can't fake or suppress, an honest advertisement of our emotional state. No other primate blushes. Or if they do, you can see it through their fur. But humans, we broadcast our internal states on our faces for everyone to see. This created a kind of emotional transparency that would have been incredibly valuable in the small, tight-knit groups where humans lived. You could tell at a glance if someone was lying, uncomfortable, attracted to you, or feeling guilty. This made cooperation easier and deception harder. The archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. As human populations expanded after the bottleneck, we see increasing evidence of complex social behaviors that would require sophisticated communication. The trade networks, the standardized tool production, the coordinated hunting strategies, all of this would have been easier with enhanced facial communication. But sexual selection for hairlessness had another consequence, one that would become increasingly important as humans spread across the planet. It exposed our skin to environmental variation, and skin, unlike fur, responds quickly to different selective pressures. When humans were confined to Africa, skin color variation was probably limited. Dark skin, rich in melanin, protected against the intense UV radiation at equatorial latitudes. But as populations moved into Europe and Asia after the bottleneck, they encountered very different sunlight conditions, less intense UV, particularly in northern latitudes, where winters are long and dark. Dark skin in these environments became a disadvantage because skin doesn't just need protection from UV radiation. It needs to synthesize vitamin D, and that requires UV exposure. Too much melanin in low UV environments meant vitamin D deficiency, which causes rickets, weakened bones, and reduced reproductive success. So natural selection lightened skin in northern populations, not all at once, but gradually over thousands of generations. By the time modern humans reached Europe, around 40,000 years ago, some populations had probably already begun evolving lighter skin tones, and the process accelerated as they moved further north. This created the remarkable diversity of human skin colors we see today, from the darkest brown in equatorial populations to the palest cream in northern Europeans and Northeast Asians. All of it became possible because we lost our fur and exposed our skin to direct selection. But here's what's fascinating. Even as skin color diversified, preferences for certain skin qualities remained universal. Every human culture ever studied values smooth, clear, even-toned skin. Regardless of whether that skin is dark or light, the preference for unblemished skin appears to be a human universal. This suggests the original selective pressure that drove hairlessness. The value of being able to assess health through visible skin remained important even as populations adapted to different environments. Different cultures developed different preferences for other aspects of appearance. Body proportions, facial features, even the amount of retained body hair considered attractive varied enormously. Some cultures prized hairlessness and developed elaborate hair removal practices. Others valued body hair as a sign of masculinity and strength, but the underlying ability to see skin, to read health and emotion on its surface, that remained universal. And this brings us back to the original question. Why did humans lose their fur? The answer isn't simple. It wasn't just one pressure, one selection event. It was multiple forces acting together. Thermoregulation for persistence hunting, parasite reduction in the tropics, enhanced tactile sensitivity, better swimming ability in some populations. But running through all of it, amplifying every other pressure, was sexual selection. The simple fact that humans chose mates, based partly on visible signs of health and genetic quality, and the most honest signal you can give is your skin. Exposed, vulnerable, impossible to fake. We made ourselves naked because it made us visible. And in the desperate world, after the bottleneck, when every breeding decision mattered, when every individual was precious, that visibility was worth the cost. Human hairlessness became a feature, not a bug, a signal, not a vulnerability. And in choosing mates with less fur generation after generation, we created ours, naked, expressive, our emotions and health written on our skin for anyone to read. We became the communicating ape, the social ape, the ape that could look at another individual and know instantly what they were feeling and whether they were healthy enough to bet your genetic future on. That's the power of sexual selection. That's how mate choice shapes evolution, just as surely as any environmental pressure. We didn't just lose our fur to survive. We lost it to communicate, to signal, to advertise ourselves in a world where being seen meant being chosen, and being chosen meant everything. Now, here's where things get really interesting. 'Cause losing fur isn't like losing weight or the genetics of hairlessness. What changed in our DNA? Getting a tan. You can't just decide one day that you don't want hair anymore and have it fall off. Hair is encoded in your DNA, written into the instruction manual that builds your body from a single fertilized cell. To go from a furry ape to a mostly naked human required specific genetic changes, mutations that had to happen, spread through populations, and eventually become fixed in the entire species. And scientists have actually identified some of these mutations. They found the exact genetic changes that made us naked. Let's start with the basics. Hair growth is controlled by a complex network of genes, but a few key players do most of the heavy lifting. The gene HR, which stands for hairless, controls the transition between different phases of hair growth. When HR is working normally, it keeps hair follicles cycling through growth and rest phases, producing the thick terminal hairs that cover most mammals. But in humans, something changed. Comparative genomic studies where scientists line up the DNA of different species and look for differences have found several mutations in the human version of HR. These mutations don't eliminate the gene entirely. That would be lethal, causing severe developmental problems. Instead, they modify how the gene functions, reducing its activity in most parts of the body. The result, hair follicles that produce vellus hairs instead of terminal hairs, the thin, fine, almost invisible hairs that cover most of your body. The evolutionary compromise between being completely bald and being fully furred. But HR isn't working alone. Another crucial gene is FGF5, fibroblast growth factor 5. This gene determines how long hair can grow before the follicle enters its resting phase. In mice with broken FGF5 genes, hair just keeps growing and growing, creating these weird long-haired mutants that look like tiny Afghan hounds. In humans, FGF5 works normally in certain areas like your scalp, which is why hair on your head can grow several feet long if you never cut it. But in other areas, the gene has been modified, or its expression has been reduced, limiting hair length to barely visible fuzz. Then there's EDA, a gene that controls the density and thickness of hair follicles. Different versions of this gene create different hair textures across human populations. East Asians, for instance, tend to have a specific variant of endocrine that produces thicker individual hairs but fewer total follicles. This variant arose fairly recently in evolutionary terms, probably within the last 30,000 years, showing that human hairlessness is still evolving, still being refined by natural selection. What's fascinating is that when scientists use molecular clock analysis, looking at how many mutations have they accumulated and calculating backward to estimate when changes occurred, they get a timeline that matches perfectly with the other evidence for human hair loss. The key mutations in HR appear to have become widespread around 1.2 million years ago, give or take a few 100,000 years, which in evolutionary terms is pretty precise. This is right around the time the fossil record suggests our ancestors were losing their fur. Right around the time the climate was forcing populations into situations where hairlessness would be advantageous. But losing hair created an immediate problem, deadly serious problem. Without fur, human skin was suddenly exposed to something it had never dealt with before. Direct sunlight, intense, unfiltered ultraviolet radiation that could cause sunburn, skin cancer, and destroy folate, a crucial vitamin needed for DNA synthesis and fetal development. The SLUT on came through another set of genetic changes, mutations in genes that control skin pigmentation. The key gene here is MT1, melanocortin-1 receptor. This gene determines how much melanin, dark protective pigment, your skin cells produce. In our furry ancestors, MC1R didn't need to be particularly active. The fur provided protection from UV radiation, so skin color didn't matter much. You could have pale skin under dark fur and survive just fine. But once the fur was gone, pale skin in equatorial Africa became a death sentence. Severe sunburn, yes, but more importantly, UV radiation breaks down folate in the bloodstream. Low folate levels cause neural tube defects in developing fetuses, leading to miscarriages and birth defects. Any individual with a pale skin mutation would have lower reproductive success. Their babies would be less likely to survive. So natural selection acted fast. Within probably just a few thousand generations, the human populations remaining in Africa had evolved very dark skin, not just a tan punctual genetic changes that made their skin cells produce massive amounts of melanin. The MC1R gene in African populations shows evidence of strong positive selection, meaning individuals with dark skin variants were significantly more likely to survive and reproduce than those without. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because modern human populations show tremendous variation in skin color from the darkest possible shades in parts of Africa and Melania to the palest complexions in Northern Europe. This variation tells us something important. The evolution of hairlessness and the evolution of skin color happened in stages, not all at once. When our ancestors first lost their fur in Africa, they evolved dark skin as protection. But as human populations later migrated out of Africa into Europe and Asia, they encountered environments with much less intense sunlight. Suddenly, dark skin became a disadvantage. You need some UV radiation to hit your skin to produce vitamin D. Without enough vitamin D, You get rickets, bone deformities, problems with calcium metabolism. In the low light conditions of northern Europe and northern Asia, especially during long winters, dark skin blocked too much UV radiation. People couldn't produce enough vitamin D, so populations that migrated north evolved lighter skin. The MC1R gene shows different mutations in European populations compared to African ones. Mutations that reduce melanin production. Interestingly, East Asian populations evolved light skin through different genetic changes, mutations in different genes, entirely. This is convergent evolution, multiple populations independently, solving the same problem through different genetic routes. It suggests that the selection pressure for appropriate skin color in different environments was incredibly strong enough to drive rapid evolution in multiple populations simultaneously. The molecular clock data suggests these skin color adaptations happened fairly recently. The variants associated with pale skin in Europeans probably emerged within the last 30,000 to 50,000 years. Some researchers think it might have happened even more recently, possibly as late as 10,000 years ago, accelerated by the adoption of agriculture, which provided a diet lower in vitamin D than the hunting and gathering lifestyle. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The key point is that losing hair required a cascade of genetic changes. First, mutations that reduced hair growth, then mutations that adjusted skin pigmentation to match local UV radiation levels. And the genetic changes didn't stop there. Remember how humans retain terminal hair in certain areas. Your scalp, armpits, groin, and for men, facial hair and chest hair. Why? What makes these areas special? The answer is in gene expression patterns. The genes for hair growth are still present everywhere in your body. Every skin cell has the complete instruction manual, but different genes get turned on and off in different locations controlled by regulatory sequences that act like molecular switches. In areas where humans retain thick hair, those regulatory switches kept the hair growth genes fully active on your scalp. This probably relates to thermoregulation, protecting your brain from overheating and preventing heat loss in cold conditions. In your armpits and groin, the retained hair serves a different function. These areas contain specialized sweat glands, apocrine, AGMs, that produce the thicker odor-causing secretions involved in scent signaling. The hair in these regions helps disperse those scents, broadcasting chemical signals about your age, sex, and reproductive status. The genetic changes that made humans mostly hairless apparently left these regions alone, possibly because the social signaling functions were important enough that natural selection preserved them. Facial hair in men is particularly interesting because it's controlled by sex hormones, specifically testosterone. The genes are the same in men and women, but testosterone activated additional regulatory switches during puberty in males, causing thicker, darker hair growth on the face, chest, and other areas. This suggests that facial hair evolved as a sexually selected trait, possibly as a signal of male maturity and dominance. The genetic basis for this involves androgen receptor genes that respond to testosterone by activating hair growth programs in specific regions. Modern human populations show significant variation in body hair, and that variation is genetically determined. Some populations are relatively hairy, others quite smooth. Mediterranean populations, for instance, tend to have more body hair than East Asian populations. This reflects different selection pressures and different evolutionary histories. In colder climates where humans wore more clothing, there might have been reduced selection pressure for complete hairlessness, allowing some populations to retain more body hair. In hotter climates, the advantages of efficient sweating might have driven more complete hair loss. What's really remarkable is how fast all these changes happened. From the first mutations in hair growth genes around 1.22 million years ago to the diversification of skin color and body hair patterns in different populations over the last 100,000 years. Human hairlessness evolved in what amounts to an evolutionary eye blink. This tells us that the selection pressures must have been enormous. Individuals with the right mutations for their environment had significantly better survival and reproductive success than those without. Natural selection was operating at maximum intensity, rapidly reshaping the human body to meet new challenges. And we can see this rapid evolution in our genomes today. When geneticists look at the patterns of variation in hair and skin pigmentation genes, they find signatures of recent selection, long stretches of DNA with very little variation, indicating that particular gene variants swept through populations so fast that neighboring DNA sequences got carried along unchanged. This is the genetic fingerprint of evolution in action. Proof that human hairlessness wasn't some gradual drift, but an active response to intense environmental pressures. The story written in our DNA is clear. Our ancestors lost their fur through specific, identifiable genetic changes. Those changes created new vulnerabilities that required additional adaptations. And the entire process was shaped by natural selection operating across hundreds of thousands and EDs of years and millions of individual lives. Every human alive today carries these mutations, these evolutionary scars from our species' long journey from furry ape to naked ape. We are quite literally the descendants of the ones who survived, being naked when being naked was dangerous. But genetic changes alone don't tell the whole story, because losing our fur had consequences that went far beyond just genetics. It changed how we lived, where we could live, and what we needed to do to survive. Consequences and adaptations, how hair loss shaped humanity. Consequences and adaptations, how humans lost their fur. Here's what most people don't realize about losing our fur. It wasn't just a cosmetic change. It fundamentally transformed what it meant to be human. Because once your ancestors shed that protective coat of hair, they became vulnerable in ways no other primate had ever experienced. And vulnerability, it turns out, is one hell of a catalyst for innovation. Think about it. A chimpanzee's ski can sleep under a tree when it rains and wake up uncomfortable but alive. Try that as a naked human in a temperate climate, and you're looking at hypothermia by morning. A gorilla can trek through thorny undergrowth without a second thought. You with your exposed skin would be torn to ribbons within minutes. Other primates can handle temperature swings of 30 or 40 degrees without much difficulty. You need shelter, fire, and clothing just to survive a typical spring day in most of Europe or Asia. So, here's the question. If being naked made us so vulnerable, how did we become the most successful large mammal on the planet? How did these hairless, fragile creatures not just survive, but dominate every terrestrial ecosystem, from the Arctic to the Sahara? The answer is that our nakedness forced us to become inventors, not just tool users. Lots of animals use tools, but systematic, creative, problem-solving inventors who could adapt to any environment through technology and culture, rather than waiting millions of years for biological evolution to do the work. Let's start with clothing, because that's the first and most obvious consequence of hairlessness. Lose your fur coat and you need a replacement. The archaeological evidence for early clothing is frustratingly sparse, because organic materials like leather and plant fibers don't preserve well, but we can date the invention of clothing through a surprising source. Lice. There are 3 types of lice that parasitize humans. Head lice, which live in scalp hair, pubic lice, which live in coarser body hair, and body lice, which live in clothing. Genetic analysis of body lice shows they diverged from head lice somewhere between 83,000 and 170,000 years ago. That's when body lice evolved as a distinct species, and they could only do that once humans started wearing clothing regularly enough for the lice to specialize in that ecological niche. So by around 100,000 years ago, your ancestors were wearing clothes, not occasionally, not just for special occasions, but regularly enough that parasites evolved to exploit this new habitat. This represents a cognitive revolution. Making clothing isn't like picking up a stick to probe for termites. You have to imagine the finished product before you start. You have to understand abstract concepts like cutting, joining, and fitting. You need to develop entirely new technologies. Scraping hides, processing plant fibers, creating needles and thread, inventing ways to tie or stitch materials together. More importantly, you have to teach these skills to your children. Clothing manufacture became one of the first truly complex technologies that required generational knowledge transfer. A young chimpanzee can learn to use a termite stick by watching mom a few times. Learning to make a fitted garment from animal hides requires years of instruction and practice. This created selection pressure for teaching ability and learning capacity. Individuals who were better at acquiring and transmitting complex skills had survival advantages. Their children were more likely to survive cold nights. Their groups were more likely to thrive in challenging environments. Over thousands of generations, this refined human cognitive abilities in ways that set us apart from every other species. But clothing was just a beginning. Because here's the thing about being a naked ape in a world that regularly drops below freezing. Clothing helps, but it's not enough. You need fire, not just for cooking. Lots of animals can eat raw food, not just for protection. Though that's useful, you need fire to literally stay alive through the night. In most of the world's temperate and cold zones, early humans had been using fire opportunistically for maybe 1 million years. Lightning strikes, natural wildfires. These could be exploited for warmth and cooking. But hairlessness created pressure to control fire systematically, to make it on demand, maintain it through wet conditions, transport it from place to place, and teach others how to manage it safely. Archaeological sites from around 400,000 years ago show evidence of systematic fire use, hearths that were maintained over long periods, careful placement of fires inside caves and rock shelters, strategic use of different woods for different purposes. This represents another technological leap. Fire management requires planning, knowledge of materials, understanding of combustion and airflow. It's chemistry and engineering without the formal concepts. More than that, fire created new social dynamics. A fire needs tending. Someone has to gather fuel, maintain the flames, make sure it doesn't spread dangerously. This creates opportunities for labor, specialization. While some group members hunt or gather, others maintain the fire. While some sleep, others keep watch and feed the flames. Fire also changes when and where humans can socialize. Before controlled fire, your ancestors would have been like other primates, active during daylight, resting at night in trees or protected locations. Fire extended the day. It created a focal point for evening gatherings. Anthropologists think this is when storytelling evolved, when elder knowledge began to be systematically transmitted through narratives told around the fire. The technology that we needed because we lost our fur became the centerpiece of human cultural evolution. And then there's shelter. Furred animals can sleep rough most nights without serious consequences. Naked humans cannot. We need protection from elements that other primates shrug off. This forced our ancestors to become builders and architects. Early shelters were probably simple caves and rock overhangs. Natural protection that required minimal modification. But caves aren't everywhere, and they're often occupied by other large predators who aren't interested in sharing. So, humans learned to build. The earliest constructed shelters date back at least 400,000 years, circles of stones that probably anchored wooden frames covered with hides or vegetation. These aren't impressive by modern standards, but they represent something revolutionary. The ability to create artificial environments, to modify your surroundings rather than just adapting to them. This skill set would eventually let humans colonize literally every land environment on Earth. The Arctic, where winter temperatures drop to -40 and darkness lasts for months. The tropical rainforests where constant moisture and biting insects make life miserable for any large mammal. The deserts where daytime heat can kill in hours and lights get cold enough to freeze. No other large mammal lives in all these environments. Polar bears stay in the Arctic. Jaguars stick to the tropics. Camels avoid the poles. But humans, fragile, hairless, vulnerable. Humans, we're everywhere. Not because we biologically adapted to each environment. That would take millions of years, but because we culturally adapted. We invented parkas and igloos for the Arctic, breathable clothing, and raised dwellings for the Arctic, breathable clothing, and raised dwellings for the tropics, desert robes, and water storage. Our nakedness, which should have been a fatal weakness, became our greatest strength because it forced us to develop the cognitive and cultural tools to adapt to anything. But the consequences went beyond just technology. Hairlessness changed our social dynamics in profound ways, because when you're naked, you're visible. Every scar tells a story. Every injury is apparent. Physical condition, age, health status, these become immediately obvious in ways they aren't for furred animals. This created new opportunities for social signaling. Body decoration emerged as a way to communicate identity and status. Ochre and other pigments show up in archaeological sites from at least 100,000 years ago, not for camouflage or practical purposes, but for adornment. Humans were painting themselves, creating visual markers of group membership, individual identity, and social status. The same is true for scarification and tattooing, which show up in the archaeological record through preserved skin and artistic representations. These aren't just decorations, they're information systems, ways of encoding social meaning onto the visible canvas of naked skin. Modern humans continue this tradition in wildly diverse ways. Every culture has developed elaborate practices around body hair maintenance. Some remove it almost entirely. Others cultivate specific styles. Some see high lustness as attractive. Others view it as childish or weak. There's no universal standard because the meanings we assign to body hair are entirely cultural, not biological. What's fascinating is that humans are the only species that deliberately modifies its hair for social and aesthetic reasons. No other animal spends time styling, cutting, dyeing, or removing its fur. This behavior only makes sense in a species that's already mostly hairless, where the remaining hair has become a canvas for cultural expression, rather than serving primarily functional purposes. And we're not done evolving. Evolutionary biologists who study human morphology have some interesting predictions about where we're heading. 'Cause here's the thing about body hair, we're still losing it. Modern humans have less body hair than humans did 10,000 years ago, and that trend seems likely to continue. Why? Because we've created artificial environments, climate-controlled buildings, protective clothing, central heating, and air conditioning. Natural selection for body hair has essentially stopped in modern technological societies. There's no survival advantage to having more body hair when you live in a house and wear clothes. There's also no significant disadvantage to having less. So, what happens is genetic drift. Random mutations that reduce body hair don't get selected out because they don't affect survival or reproduction. Over thousands of generations, these mutations accumulate. Some models suggest that in another 100,000 years, humans might have even less body hair than we do now, perhaps retaining only eyebrows, eyelashes, and scalp hair, which still serve clear protective functions. But here's what's truly remarkable. None of this matters for human survival anymore. Whether we have more body hair or less, whether we keep our remaining hair or lose it entirely, it won't affect our ability to thrive on this planet because we long ago transcended the biological constraints that limit other species. We lost our fur and had to invent clothing that made us inventors. We needed fire and had to control it. That made us engineers. We required shelter and had to build it. That made us architects. Every vulnerability that came from our nakedness forced us to develop new capabilities, new technologies, new social systems, new ways of understanding and manipulating the world around us. And that's the real consequence of hairlessness. It didn't just change what we looked like, it changed what we were capable of becoming. It transformed us from just another African ape into something unprecedented, a species that could adapt to any environment, not through evolution, but through innovation. A species that could colonize an entire planet, not by developing specialized biology for each habitat, but by developing the cognitive tools to create specialized solutions for each challenge. We are naked because our ancestors needed to run down prey under the African sun, or because they spent time in the water, or because they needed to avoid parasites, or because they needed to avoid parasites, or because probably all of these reasons played some role. But we are human, truly human, because being naked forced us to become something more than our biology. Something that could survive through creativity rather than adaptation, through culture rather than evolution, through innovation rather than instinct. That's the legacy of hairlessness, not just the strange appearance it gives us, but the extraordinary capabilities it forced us to develop, the technologies, the social structures, the cognitive abilities that make us unlike any other creature that has ever lived on this planet. We lost our fur, and in losing it, we gained the world. So here's where conclusion, the naked truth about human evolutio. We end up after following the trail of our missing fur, across millions of years of evolutionary history, with a simple but profound realization. There was no single moment when humans lost their hair, no dramatic mutation, no sudden evolutionary leap, just layer upon layer of evolutionary pressures, each one pushing our ancestors toward increasingly bare skin. The Savannah hypothesis, running under the brutal African sun, needing to dump heat faster than any other mammal. The aquatic ape theory, maybe spending enough time in water that fur became a liability rather than an asset. The parasite problem, every louse, every tick, every disease-carrying insect providing natural selection, with another reason to favor hairless individuals. Sexual selection, smooth skin becoming a nifficle of health, youth, attractiveness, social signaling, the ability to blush, to show emotion through our exposed faces, creating deeper bonds and more sophisticated communication. None of these explanations alone is sufficient, but together they paint a picture of evolutionary forces converging on the same solution. Hair had to go, and when it did, everything changed. Because here's the thing about losing our fur. It wasn't just a cosmetic change. It was a cascade that shaped nearly everything that makes us human. Without hair, we needed clothing. The development of clothing required planning, tool-making, abstract reasoning. It pushed our ancestors to think ahead, to prepare for future needs. Without fur's protection, we needed shelter. Not just temporary sleeping spots, but constructed spaces that required cooperation and innovation to build. Without hair to provide insulation, we needed fire. Mastering fire meant mastering one of nature's most dangerous forces. It meant developing the cognitive capacity to maintain and control something that could easily kill you. The thermoregulation problem to become the planet's best endurance athletes that shaped our entire body plan. Long legs, narrow hips, specialized foot architecture. The need to cool our overheating brains during persistence hunts drove selection for more efficient neural structures. Bigger brains, but also better organized, more energy efficient, and the social aspects of hairlessness. The ability to read emotions on bare faces, to signal through blushing and complexion changes that laid groundwork for the sophisticated social systems that would eventually let us build civilizations. We are naked apes, and that nakedness connects to language, tool use, art, biculture, everything that separates us from our closest primate relatives. All of it traces back, at least in part, to those first ancestors who started losing their fur under the African sun millions of years ago. The ones who discovered that bare skin could be an advantage if you were smart enough and social enough to work around its vulnerabilities. Your ancestors were those individuals, the ones who survived despite being naked and vulnerable, who turned a potential weakness into humanity's greatest strength, who learned to dominate every environment on Earth. Despite having none of the natural armor, fur, claws, or fangs that other apex predators relied on. They did it with intelligence, cooperation, and the evolutionary adaptations that came from being furless primates trying to survive in a dangerous world. Every time you sweat through a workout, you're using the cooling system that hair loss made possible. Every time you bundle up against the cold, you're compensating for the insulation your ancestors lost. Every time you read emotion on someone's face, you're using the communication advantages that bare skin provided. We are the descendants of the naked apes, and that nakedness made us human. So, if you're still listening, if this journey through evolutionary history has given you a new appreciation for your own hairless skin, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. And if you want more deep dives into the evolutionary quirks that made us who we are, hit that subscribe button. Because understanding our past, understanding why we look the way we do and how we got here, that's not just academic curiosity, that's understanding ourselves. The naked truth about human evolution is that we're all carrying the legacy of every evolutionary pressure, every environmental challenge, every genetic quirk that shaped our ancestors over millions of years. And somehow, against all odds, they survived long enough to become